Welcome to Underdiagnosed, a podcast to discuss all things ADHD. I'm your host, Madison Young, an MPH student and woman learning to manage life with late diagnosed ADHD.
0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful.
Speaking of women with ADHD, I'm joined today by my guest and friend, Kylie Akiona. Kylie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kylie, what do you imagine the average person thinks of when they hear ADHD?
Well, for me, I think they see a disruptive little white boy who has a hard time paying attention in class, or he's disrupting other kids learning in like a classroom setting.
Yeah, I think that image has really become a stereotype of ADHD that I want to help break down. ADHD has long been misunderstood, underdiagnosed, and honestly pretty poorly named.
Yeah.
It's actually been estimated that half of girls and women with ADHD may remain undiagnosed, which is thought to be a result of a mixture of lack of research on this population and widespread misunderstandings of what living with ADHD actually looks like in girls and adults. I'm so thankful we both beat those odds so that we could be here today having this conversation. So I personally was only diagnosed 2 years ago after struggling to figure out why I was having such a hard time reaching my personal goals. I had a huge misunderstanding of what ADHD was and would have never even considered the possibility of it prior to exploring social media content from people with ADHD talking about their experiences. I had a huge amount of imposter syndrome when it came to accepting this as my reality, and finally receiving a clinical diagnosis was so huge in allowing me to foster self-love and understanding. It truly has been incredibly validating and positively life-changing to receive an ADHD diagnosis, but honestly, I do wonder what my life could have been like if I had received the diagnosis in my childhood. If you don't mind sharing, what was being diagnosed like for you, Kylie?
Well, I feel like I had a pretty similar experience to you, actually. I only got diagnosed recently, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, after I had gotten home from school on the continent. And it felt really validating to feel like I finally understood how my brain functions just a little bit better just through that one diagnosis. And I only realized that I might have ADHD when I was in college, when I noticed that I used to be really good at school back in like elementary or like middle school days, and I would like read a lot and actually be focused in class.
And it's easy.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it was super easy too. But I think I only noticed that all of that changed when I had first started high school. And I kind of just figured, well, maybe everything is like harder for me to do, so I just can't focus as much. But when I got into college, I realized like, oh no, like I actually can't focus like everybody else does. But I feel like experience is the same for like us and a lot of other people, but particularly for women, queer folks, and BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color who are told our whole lives that we just need to try harder to focus or be better or just like simply fix our systems and just be better.
Right, because it's us that's wrong
exactly.
instead of the environment being wrong.
Yeah, no.
I think that if people are misinformed or misunderstanding the various symptoms of ADHD, it can be very difficult to recognize it because it, in a lot of cases, is a very unseen disorder for people without incredibly obvious hyperactive symptoms. Hyperactivity for some can be in the form of racing thoughts, frequent fidgeting, etc. It would be impossible to fully explain the complex underworkings of ADHD in this time limit, but I think that it can be helpful to think of ADHD as a cousin to autism when it comes to symptoms because many do overlap.
Yeah.
And just for example, my main symptoms of ADHD tend to be a short attention span, excessive fidgeting, racing thoughts, 1,000 hobbies, impulse problems, social anxiety, overstimulation. Kylie, how do symptoms present for you?
I love that for us because I have a lot of the same symptoms that you just shared. I get really overwhelmed and exhausted really easily. I get a lot of anxiety. I can get really hyper-focused on something just like super randomly and forget everything else that I was doing. I feel out of control a lot of times. I can be really messy and I have a hard time organizing my thoughts and my life generally. You should see my room. lots of imposter syndrome and overthinking. And I just generally take like a longer time to process things or understand things. And there's definitely more that I'm forgetting, of course, because ADHD girly. Yes.
I wanted to also talk about what unrecognized and unmanaged ADHD can lead to. It is known that ADHD is highly comorbid with other mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorders due to fundamental differences in our brain functions. I think that these mental health disorders and the ADHD tendency towards impulsivity and inclination to risk can really lead people in paths of self-destruction through substance abuse and crime, especially when we don't learn the skills and tools to recognize and address these symptoms. In adulthood, ADHD is associated with unemployment or working in unskilled occupations, difficulty maintaining jobs, impaired work performance, and financial stress. In addition, ADHD has consistently been found to be higher in correctional settings than in the general population. There are varying estimates, but the median prevalence is around 1/4. So 25% of incarcerated pupils are estimated to have ADHD.
Yeah.
Which is a lot.
That's a lot of
That's
people.
a lot of people.
Yeah.
So are these estimates surprising to you, Kylie?
Absolutely not. I feel like, especially in Hawaii and in like America in general, we're one of the top incarcerators in the world. I think America is like maybe number one incarcerator out of all the countries.
I believe it.
And I think Hawaii is the top. If it's considered as its own country, it's the top 25 incarcerator in the whole world. I don't know if I said that right.
I understand it though. So
No, yeah, perfect. But I feel like in Hawaii, the number of people with mental disabilities, including ADHD, are more likely to be incarcerated, and it's just not that different from the statistic that you had just shared. I think the way that we perceive mental disabilities generally in an Americanized society is extremely harmful and actually perpetuates these cycles of criminalization that intentionally target oppressed populations. Americanized and other Western imperial societies use prisons and jails and policing, handcuffs, and criminalization as expensive and ineffective ways to solve, quote unquote, lots of systemic issues like disability and like ADHD. Even though countless and growing research is proving that the reality is that these forms of oppression, like carceral systems, don't actually solve anything because they're not addressing the root causes of people's quote-unquote disruptive or criminal behavior, which most times is simply people's basic needs not being met by a society and a government that intentionally fails to meet them. And I think Hawaii's legislature has only recently in the past few years tried to introduce bills and measures that don't criminalize people with mental disabilities, again, like ADHD, but has continuously failed to pass any of them because of a lot of the stigmas that are in our communities here. I think especially in our communities of color or like overexploited communities where, again, there's these stigmas that we talked about earlier, like, well, you're just not trying hard enough. Right. Or you just need to, like, I don't know, not be yourself. But yeah, I think it's not surprising, and I'm sure it's not that different for people in Hawaii as well. Yeah,
I'd be interested in seeing, I wish they would do a study to see what our incarcerated population's ADHD rates are.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be great information to have.
Yeah.
Because I want to present a possibility that I've been contemplating for a while. I've just been thinking, if we've grossly underestimated women with ADHD for as long as we have, could it be possible that other populations, such as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, could have been underdiagnosed with ADHD as well? And after doing some research, I found very limited information about the prevalence of ADHD or other developmental disorders amongst Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. But I did find a study that looked at 2014 survey results from Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander children, which estimated the prevalence to be about 4.5%. And in the same study, it was reported that white children were diagnosed more than twice as often at more about 9.3%. A different study done amongst adult Kaiser patients in California showed that the white population was diagnosed with ADHD at least double the rate of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So, of course, it really could be that ADHD is more common amongst white people, but given that women have historically been underdiagnosed, it would not surprise me if other groups have been underdiagnosed as well. So
Yeah.
can you share any thoughts on this, Kylie?
Sure. And I think your suspicion is right on the dot, and I'm absolutely not surprised that there's such limited research on this and that the results are presenting that way, especially for oppressed groups like Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. We could talk about other indigenous populations, Black, Brown, and Latinx populations. But I feel like one of the biggest reasons for those kinds of results where white people are doubly diagnosed, whatever the right wording for that is. Doubly. Yeah.
That sounds right.
Doubly diagnosed. For that is because of our experience with as colonized peoples, and I'm Native Hawaiian, so that's where I'm speaking from when I'm saying this. As colonized peoples with healthcare and Western systems that are not our own and which have fully replaced and erased and colonized what we previously knew before colonization and imperialism as our cultural systems of care and health that we practiced and succeeded in for thousands of years before Western quote-unquote modern medicine and capitalist healthcare systems ever existed. So, of course, a lot of our families and individuals place a lot of rightful and logical distrust in what we know to be healthcare today, which for generations has directly exploited, abused, stereotyped, and genocided our people. And this legacy of racism, white supremacy, elitism, ableism, and misogyny, of course, all still persists in our healthcare systems. And I feel like BIPOC and disabled people specifically are drastically more exploited than white and privileged populations, but this doesn't mean that our systems are failing us when they're underdiagnosing us and when they're not giving us the medication or care that we need. Rather, they're functioning exactly the way that they were built to function for the people that built them, which is like rich, able-bodied white men. So, of course, healthcare is denied and inaccessible to us, and of course, we're going to be underdiagnosed.
And just overlooked.
No, exactly, because they're not meant to be accessible for people like us.
Yeah.
And they're extremely expensive and extremely exclusive of those who need it the most. And I think it's really important that we view ADHD and other physical disabilities or quote-unquote disorders through these lenses of race and gender and class, especially here in Hawaii in the illegally occupied Hawaiian Kingdom.
Yeah, that was beautifully stated.
Thank you. I tried my best.
Thanks. Yeah, and then obviously people with ADHD are not the only ones disproportionately imprisoned.
Absolutely.
It's been estimated that around 40% of incarcerated people in Hawaii are Native Hawaiian, although they only make up about 10% of the general population.
Yeah.
I find it notable that many of the Hawaiian people who have been incarcerated struggle with substance abuse disorders, and we know that for people with ADHD, substance abuse disorders are a common co-occurrence. If my hunch is correct, I'm wondering if this could partially help put into context why Native Hawaiians are disproportionately imprisoned, besides the troubling historical context and institutional racism, which obviously exists and should be acknowledged.
100%.
And this may currently just be a loose connection that I'm making, and it needs substantial more research, and by no means should we label or assume that all Native Hawaiians with substance abuse disorders have ADHD. But I feel it's important that we explore the possibility that ADHD is more common in this population than it's currently being reported.
Yeah.
So how do we get more people diagnosed so that they can, in the future, avoid the common pitfalls of life with ADHD, like substance abuse and incarceration? I think a huge step is correcting the public misunderstandings and stigma. ADHD has commonly been referred to as a fake disorder that was made up as an excuse for being lazy, immature, and unwilling to conform. Symptoms tend to be perceived by many as a moral problem, and many people with ADHD are just told that they should have more self-control, they should work harder, and honestly, when I told my mother that I thought I had ADHD, she really just told me I needed more discipline.
It's so terrible. But same.
But I forgive her.
Yeah.
Targeted mental health literacy could provide an important avenue for improving the broader community's attitudes toward those with ADHD. And it's been shown that people who have knowledge of ADHD and less stigma hold more positive attitudes towards mainstream inclusion, and by providing ADHD informational training to teachers, parents, physicians, even correctional facilities, it's way more likely that ADHD symptoms will be recognized and people can be referred for screening for ADHD and possibly be diagnosed.
Yeah.
And additionally, we could use common comorbid disorders such as substance abuse or major depressive disorders as prompts to send a person for ADHD screening as well. And when people think of treatments for ADHD, they often think of Adderall and Ritalin. But truly, these medications are not entirely or at all necessary for ADHD management. They are helpful for productivity, sure, but especially with the current medication shortages, just not a sustainable option for management. There are other great self-management strategies for people with ADHD that can help us to understand ourselves and fit into the larger society that was not designed for us. These strategies could be easily disseminated through a video series or other means. I myself enjoy watching YouTube videos that help me figure out ways to manage my ADHD symptoms, particularly for time blindness, short-term memory problems, short attention span, fidgeting. And for example, I've learned how to use meditation, yoga, and mindfulness to calm myself when I have racing thoughts. And I've started using strategies such as breaking down tasks into smaller chunks and the Pomodoro method to help me be more productive. And I was wondering if you have any ADHD tips and tricks for us, Kylie.
So my tips are that I have none.
Yeah.
No
tips.
No, yeah, the tips are non-existent. No, but I think that's a really great question that I'm still trying to figure out too, because I used to be on the Adderall XR, extended release, whatever, for like the longest time.
I still take Ritalin.
Yeah, exactly, because it is super helpful.
It is helpful.
And like, love medicated girlies.
I probably wrote this after taking some Ritalin. Wrote this script.
Yeah, totally feel that. I wish I wrote mine when I was medicated, because it would make a lot more sense.
No, it was great.
Thank you. But I was on Adderall for like the longest time. It's probably the only way that I graduated college. But I think like right after I graduated, thank Akua, like there was this huge shortage across the continent or whatever, and here. So I just stopped taking it, and I tried a couple of like the other alternatives, and it just didn't work for me. It kind of did the opposite for me, actually. So I've been unmedicated for a little while now, maybe like over a year, and I'm still trying to figure out how to actually manage my ADHD and how I manage my life day to day without getting like too unfocused on something. But I use probably some similar methods to you, like breaking tasks down similarly. Like I'll write things down. I'll try to like keep up with my phone calendar so that I know like if I need to be somewhere like for this, even I had to put this in my calendar so I remembered. What else? I think especially for Native Hawaiian and Oceania folks, I'm most focused and most in tune with myself when I'm doing like decolonial and politically centered stuff, like going to the lo'i, or I'm weaving, or I'm writing poetry, or I'm putting together my mo'okuauhao, which is like genealogy research, or just doing other cultural things with my besties and comrades in struggle. But that's all the tips that I have. Really is just do what works best for you.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
cultural stuff is also really helpful for me too.
Yeah, it really is an individual journey to finding what works for you. Thank you so much for sharing, Kylie. As we conclude, I just want to reiterate that by no means do I think we should assume that Native Hawaiian people who are incarcerated or struggle with substance abuse disorders have ADHD or other developmental disorders without proper screening and diagnosis by a professional. I want to end this podcast by emphasizing that this is an area that definitely warrants more research before we reach conclusions, because there is still so much we don't know about ADHD. But I hope that this podcast can serve as a think piece for people to start getting a better understanding of ADHD and how possible misunderstandings and underdiagnosis of ADHD could actually be a pervasive social issue that actually has easily implementable solutions. Thank you for your time, and I hope this discussion was at least thought-provoking. I'm excited to listen to everyone else's podcast.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.